Hi everyone, thank you for joining. Recently I did a presentation at the Canadian Evaluation Society conference called 6 Hacks for Renovating Your Evaluation Report and got some good feedback on it, so wanted to record it again and share it for all of you so you could take a look back if you saw it at the conference, or if you're joining for the first time, hopefully take away one design hack that you can incorporate into your evaluation reporting. So before we start, this is me. I'm Kristy Madsen. I am a credentialed evaluator and co-founder of HIve Consulting and Eval Academy. And our mission really is to provide people with evaluation expertise. So whether that's information, people, tools, to uncover insights that ultimately help organizations or even individuals drive change and impact. So with that being said, let's get started. So again, I'm going to be presenting on what I call the 6 hacks for renovating your evaluation report, and I'm hoping by the end of this presentation that you'll walk away with at least one design hack that you can incorporate into your reporting. And so some of you might be evaluators that are joining this presentation and you're thinking, I'm an evaluator, I'm not a designer, but as evaluators, we really need to be good communicators, and particularly we need to be good visual communicators because oftentimes we're presenting our findings in written formats, in reports. So that's where Canva comes in, and that was the inspiration for this presentation. And for those of you who don't know, Canva is a website, and they believe that anyone can be a designer. It just takes a little bit of know-how and some basic design practices and principles. And so I was inspired by this. I took their basic graphic design course and, have taken some of that information and, summarized it into these 6 hacks. So, so ultimately I'm hoping that all of you will be able to create reports that your stakeholders, that your clients, your decision makers, that they want to read, they can easily understand, they can remember, and then, ultimately use. And so that we can, stop writing reports that look like this. This was my capstone report that I did for my master's in public health. And, I'm sure it looks familiar to a lot of you. And that's because we were taught to write like this in school. And we were taught to use APA style. We were taught to use sophisticated language. And, use formatting that looks like it's going to be published in some sort of journal. And then when we leave school, we carry these habits on, and then we're kind of shocked and dismayed when people open our reports and they don't want to read them and can't get past this first page. And they can't get past this first page because when our eyes look at this, it takes our brain a lot of energy to focus, pay attention, and comprehend that information. And so if any of you wanted to read more of that, there is a well-known evaluator who's called Jane Davidson, and she's actually written a journal article that gets into this in more depth, and it's called Unlearning Some of Our Social Science Habits. Okay, so let's jump into it. So this first hack is called Take Them on a Journey. And this is really about crafting a story that leads your audience to a destination. So what happens when we write capstone reports like the one that I just showed you, or just reports in general, is that we take our audience on a really long and a really boring journey. We lead our audience through this extensive background, a really comprehensive lit review, really detailed methodology. Then we might get to the findings somewhere, 40 pages in, and then might have a discussion about what those findings mean and what people are to do about it. Hashtag too long, didn't read. So instead we can better engage our audience in our reporting through the use of story. And why we want to do that is because our brains really love stories. And, we're much more likely to remember information if we activate our imagination and our emotions instead of presenting, facts alone and pages of graphs. And the reason for that is because a story takes people on a journey. It has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end, and then ultimately a well-written story will feature some sort of transformation. And it's this journey that really activates that imagination, that activates those emotions, and gives our message staying power. Not only this, a good story will motivate people to act. And, as evaluators, that's ultimately what we want, is we want people to read what we have written, remember it, and be able to act and do something about it. So as an evaluator, what does this mean to you and your reporting? So this first hack, what I'm suggesting is you really rethink how you structure your report. And you take your audience on that journey through a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so the beginning is really describing to your audience the world as they know it. It's maybe nothing new, but it's presenting, what the issue is, what the problem is. And then up front, you want to put in okay, here's what we found, here's what you should do about it, so people don't have to wait until the very end of the journey. In the middle, you want to kind of dig into your findings in more detail. But instead of just presenting your findings, finding after finding after finding, and then at the end discussing them and your conclusions, you're going to layer in your discussion of what those findings mean and what people should do about it, so your recommendations throughout the middle of your report. And then at the end, that's really when you're going to talk about what do people need to do, and then how is the world, how are they, or how is their organization going to be different by implementing some of the recommendations that you've recommended. So the second hack is called Consistency is Cool, and it really boils down to giving our brains some consistent cues throughout our reports. And the reason we want to do that is because our brains are constantly searching for visual cues. And our brains do that because they're lazy, and it makes learning easier. So, 2 easy cues that we can incorporate into our reporting is the use of consistent color and the use of consistent font. So when you're using color in your report, you want to create a strong color palette to use throughout your report. And, we're evaluators, we're not designers, so you don't have to, have a strong knowledge of color theory. There's lots of sites out there that already have really nice palettes that you can use. Adobe Color is one, Color Lovers, Coolers, I think that's how you say it. Are some of the sites that you can go to, and they have really nice palettes that you can choose from. And so when you're creating a color palette for your report, one of the things that you want to think about is being intentional about your choice of color and the mood that it conveys. And so on the screen here, I have a picture or an image that I used for one of my reports. And this was a report where the outcomes were focused on wellness and well-being in women. And so I chose an image that, to me, displayed that and conveyed that. And then I took the greens from that image and created a color palette centered around greens, because green is associated with growth, with health, with nature, concepts that were related to those intended outcomes. And so, being intentional about color helps our brain, again, with that pattern recognition, and again, helps our brain understand and retain information. So once you've created your color palette, you can create your own custom palette in a Microsoft product like PowerPoint, and then use it throughout your report, like I did in this report, to again create that consistent, cohesive look, cueing the brain throughout your report with color. So another way to create consistency throughout your report is with fonts. And so similar to color, fonts should be used purposefully to signal, important elements in your report. And the best way that you can do that is to create font hierarchies in your report. So in your report, you want to have titles, you want to have subtitles, and then various heading levels that, are formatted slightly differently, but again, used consistently to cue your brain when it's moving to different sections of the report. And so here's an example of a font hierarchy that I used in that same report I was just mentioning, where I used a specific font and formatting for the section, for the focus area of the evaluation question, and then the different elements beneath that. So the third hack is called practice proximity, and if anyone's heard of the Gestalt principles, there's one called the principle of proximity, which basically states that objects that are close together are perceived as a group. Looking at shapes, if we look at this picture here on the screen, it's a series of individual rod shapes that are just grouped together to make it look like a deer. But if we were to break those rods apart, that's all they are, is individual rods. And so, we can easily leverage this principle in our reporting by grouping like things together and embracing white space. So when it comes to reporting, if you're anything like me, I just start writing and dumping a bunch of findings and information down into a Word document. And then sometimes we end up with this big grouping of text, which is really dense and, again, overwhelming for our eyes and our brain to make sense of. And so the easiest way for us to kind of break up that information and to group information together is through the sensible use of paragraphs. One paragraph should have one objective and one topic. So, you might start with something like this, but once you start grouping information, you have 3 separate paragraphs like we have on the screen here, grouping similar information. You might even put a title above that, again, to cue the eyes to what it is they're reading in the paragraph beneath. Another way that you can group information in your reports is through call-out boxes. So again, if we want to direct our eyes to, in this instance, what were the questions we asked as part of our most significant change methodology, then we've taken that out and we've put it in a call-out box so people can automatically look at that instead of looking through and trying to find it in the narrative and the text. The second way you can practice proximity is to embrace white space. And so white space is really the counterbalance to your report busyness. It is the area between the different elements on a page. And so it really creates that visual breathing room that you need for your audience to pay attention, basically, and continue on reading your report. And it's, maybe one of the easiest and most effective things that you can do when you're formatting your reports. So here's an example of a page from a report, and this was one of the earlier drafts, and it had some good elements in it. We had a picture, we had a title, and whatnot. But if you look at this page, it's pretty jammed on there, all the information. So how we can infuse white space is maybe by doing something like this, where we separate the information out onto, 2 pages instead of 1. The 1 page is where we kind of give some background information, but then we really want to highlight kind of the story. And so we put that onto a separate page with lots of white space around it. And you can, just looking at this, again, it's that visual breathing room that I was just mentioning. So the 4th hack is called Make It Pop. And this really relates to creating focal points on the pages of your report. So a focal point is something that really draws your reader's eye to a specific element on a page, and it's usually distinct or different from the rest of the information on the page. And so again, if you look at this slide, we can automatically see that this light bulb here that's lit up is a focal point because it's different from the other light bulbs that are in that image. And, focal points create something that's called dominance, that designers call dominance. And so creating a dominant element in your report really is important because it shows your reader, where to look and what is the important information that they need to take away. And so if we use this properly, we can actually even direct our audience's eyes and help them process information in a way that we want them to process it. So here's a report that was done by Greenpeace, and automatically if you look at this, I don't know about you, but my eyes go straight to the cover page that happens to be on the right-hand side here. It's got this strong kind of saturated image that's darker, and then my eyes go up to the top left of the page to read the information, to read the title of the report. And then they might go down to the bottom logo, and then over to the left-hand side to the introduction, and then the text beneath it. Maybe just leave it there for a second for you to think about where were your eyes going? How were you taking in that information? And so the reason that my eyes went to the right was because there's this big image there. Like I said, it's saturated, it's darker, and then they went up to the top left because typically our eyes in our culture like to go and read information from left to right. And so there's different elements that you can create focal points in your report with. And so position is one. Again, what I just talked about, elements higher on a page are perceived to weigh more than elements that are located lower down on a page. Size, if something's very large on a page, that's naturally a dominant element. Color, if something stands out being bright and the rest is gray, that will have more visual weight. Saturation, like I talked about with that image, it had saturated colors and that appeared heavier, so my eyes wanted to go look at that. And then just ultimately intrinsic interest. If some things are more interesting than others, images are interesting, things that just are different. If you look at this font here or at this slide here, the font's different, so that's naturally kind of interesting. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, that's not where my eyes went. My eyes went, to whatever page first. The bottom line is there aren't really any hard and fast rules when it comes to this. It really depends on how all these elements are laid out together. So the most important thing as an evaluator that we need to think about when we're laying out information on a page is that what are those important elements that we want people to take away, and then try out some of these different things here, size, color, saturation, and to highlight those elements so that, again, we can draw our readers' attention to those key takeaways in our report. Hack number 5 is called Photo Love. So again, I talked about how images are naturally dominant elements. Directing your audience's eye to an image is important because, like I talked about in hack number 1, images convey stories. And like we talked about, stories are important because they help us store information in our memory for future use. So when you're selecting images for your reports, it's really important to consider strong imagery. And so strong images they're simple, they're clear, and they're sincere images, similar to this one here. So this was for an evaluation we did called the Heavy Users of Service Project, and we interviewed individuals who were considered heavy users. So these were people that were often homeless, who were suffering with mental health and addiction issues. We're using the emergency department a lot. We're had high rates of incarceration, things like that. So, for obvious reasons, we couldn't use their names or their pictures. However, we chose this image to represent this story because, as you can tell when you look at this image here, you can start to, in your mind, make up a story of who this individual is, what his story might be, what some of his challenges might be. So images are really powerful. And you might be thinking, well, images are expensive, and I don't have the money to buy an image. That image was free. That was from a site called Pixabay. But if you do have some money and you really want to buy just one good image, there is a way to kind of make your dollar stretch throughout your report. So, for instance, I bought this image for a report that I was putting together. And I really loved it because the project was really all about collaboration, relationship building. And so I chose this image, and then I used it throughout my report, again, to kind of make it stretch, but also to create that consistency and that cohesiveness that I talked about earlier. So I used it on the cover page. I used it on the back cover so that I didn't just end with a bunch of text and narrative. And then I also used it as a background in a figure that we created, just again to create some visual interest. And I switched the color of it so it had that consistent feel that this report had with other reports where we used kind of a blue palette. Okay, so the last hack is called dial down your data. And this is ultimately about simplifying the data that you put in your report. And simplifying really starts with what we talked about again in hack number 1, which is what is your story and what is it that you're trying to say? And so, I've been guilty in the past of putting in just graph after graph or table after table into a report. And I think I did that because I either wasn't clear on the story or what it was that I was trying to convey, or I was reverting back to those social science habits that we had been taught where, we need to be objective and present all the information and not have a point or give an opinion or whatnot. Again, we need to unlearn that. We need to figure out that story, what it is we're trying to tell, because this is really your filter for determining what should and should not be included in your report. And, it will also help you determine how to present your data. So, once you know what it is that you're trying to convey, then you should select a chart that best conveys that story. So, for instance, if you want to show a proportion, then you might select something like a tree map. Or if you want to show change over time, then a line graph is probably most appropriate. And so, we're no longer just limited to the simple bar or column charts that, again, we were taught way back when. There's lots of different ways to present data now. Sometimes it's so overwhelming that now there's even a bunch of online tools, chart chooser tools, that you can go to help you determine which is the best way to present your data. And so this is from a site called the Data Visualization Catalog. Stephanie Evergreen, she also has some different chart chooser tools out there. The second thing to consider when you're dialing down your data is don't default to the defaults in whatever program it is that you're using to create your graphs. So if it's Excel, we've all seen this graph that Excel creates. We've all seen this color palette that Excel uses over and over again. And this graph is fine. Like, we can, spend some time trying to figure out what that story is and what it is that we're trying to say. But again, it takes a bit more mental energy for our brains to kind of figure it out. And Excel doesn't know our story, but we can format this graph so that we're better able to present and tell that story. And so if that story in this example is that pipe cleaners are the only craft supply that met the supply target, then this simplified graph here up on the screen is much more effective at telling that story. And so I did that by, again, simplifying. I got rid of the distractions like those grid lines that were in the back. It had a y-axis. I got rid of that and instead put the counts in the columns themselves. And then, probably most importantly, I used color intentionally again to, cue our brains and our eyes to look at the pipe cleaners by using a blue and then grayed out the rest of the columns. And then I put the actual takeaway into the title of the graph as opposed to just some generic title like craft supply inventory. And so those are your 6 design hacks that hopefully you'll be able to take one away and incorporate into your evaluation reporting. If you are interested in reading more and learning more, go to Eval Academy. I have a series of 6 articles up there that go into these hacks in detail. And I also have created an infographic that summarizes these 6 hacks. Thanks so much. Have a good day.